They called humans the noisemakers when first contact was established. Every other species in the galactic consortium communicated through refined telepathic networks, shared consciousness streams, or bioelectric pulse systems that transmitted pure thought instantaneously. Humans? They made sounds with their mouths, scratched symbols on surfaces, and somehow managed to coordinate entire civilizations through what the galaxy considered primitive verbal chaos. But what the advanced species failed to understand was that this apparent weakness was humanity's greatest strength. While they shared thoughts effortlessly, humans had learned something far more powerful: the art of focused solitude. In a universe where every mind was connected, humans were the only species that had mastered the terrifying and magnificent power of thinking alone. Dr. Sarah Chen didn't know she was about to prove that the quietest minds could shake the foundations of reality itself. She only knew that in 36 hours, the Galactic Consortium would vote on whether humanity deserved a seat among the truly intelligent species or if they should be classified as clever pets, forever barred from the deeper mysteries of the universe. The galaxy was about to learn that underestimating the human mind was the most dangerous mistake a civilization could make. The crystalline walls of the consortium's primary research facility hummed with the collective thoughts of 12 different species, their mental energies creating visible aurora patterns that danced across the transparent surfaces. Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her palm against the cool wall and felt absolutely nothing. No whisper of consciousness, no shared emotional current, no gentle tug of telepathic invitation. Just silence. Still trying to connect? Dr. Vexai asked, his four eyes blinking in sequence as he approached. The Zolonian's thoughts rippled outward like stones thrown into still water, easily readable by anyone within 100 meters. His concern was genuine, tinged with the particular sadness that came from watching someone struggle with what others considered as natural as breathing. Sarah dropped her hand and turned to face her colleague. Not trying to connect. Just appreciating the quiet. This answer seemed to puzzle Vexai even more. His thoughts flickered with confusion, broadcasting his internal question to every sensitive mind in the vicinity: how could anyone appreciate isolation when unity was possible? The evaluation committee has finished their preliminary assessment, Vexai said aloud, switching to vocal communication out of courtesy for Sarah's limitations. They want to speak with you before the final vote tomorrow. Sarah had expected this. For the past 3 months, she had been the subject of intense scrutiny as the consortium's experts tried to determine whether humans possessed true intelligence or merely advanced mimicry. The fact that humans couldn't participate in the thought streams that connected all other sapient species had led many to conclude that they were evolutionary dead ends, clever enough to build starships but too primitive to join the real conversation of consciousness. What did their assessment conclude? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. Vexai's discomfort radiated outward before he could control it. They believe humans may be uniquely gifted in individual problem solving, but fundamentally limited by your inability to achieve collective consciousness. The vote tomorrow will likely classify your species as Category 3, Advanced Tool Users. Category 3. Not true sapiens, but worthy of protection and study. Like particularly clever dolphins or unusually organized insects. The classification would mean humans could never access the deepest archives of galactic knowledge, never participate in the grand projects that required unified mental effort, never be trusted with technologies that required telepathic coordination to operate safely. Sarah nodded calmly, her reaction apparently surprising Vexai, who had expected anger or despair. I'd like to address the committee before they vote. Sarah, they've made up their minds. The evidence is overwhelming. Your species simply cannot achieve the mental unity that defines true intelligence. You're isolated inside your own heads. Exactly, Sarah said, and, for the first time since arriving at the facility, she smiled. The evaluation committee consisted of representatives from each of the consortium's founding species, the Zolonians with their crystalline thought-sharing, the hive-minded Thexera, the energy-being Luminari who existed as pure consciousness, the plant-like Verdani whose root networks span continents and shared memories across generations, the aquatic pelagics whose songs carried thoughts through entire ocean worlds, and 6 others whose mental abilities made them seem like gods to most. Primitive species. They gathered in the Great Assembly, their combined consciousness creating a maelstrom of shared thought that would have driven most beings insane within seconds. Sarah sat in the center, surrounded by minds that could rewrite reality through collective will, and felt perfectly at ease in her isolation. Dr. Chen, began the Luminari representative, its voice a harmony of pure energy. We have great respect for your individual achievements. Your personal research into quantum consciousness has been remarkable for a single mind working alone. However, continued the Thexera representative, speaking with the voice of 10,000 integrated individuals, we cannot ignore the fundamental limitation that prevents your species from achieving true sapience. You are trapped in individual consciousness, unable to share thoughts, pool knowledge, or achieve the unity that defines intelligent life. Sarah stood slowly, her movement drawing the attention of every being present. Honored representatives, I would like to propose a test. The committee members exchanged rapid thought bursts, their discussion occurring at speeds far beyond human comprehension. After what seemed like an eternity of mental consultation, the Verdani representative spoke. What kind of test? Give me a problem that has stumped the consortium's greatest minds. Something that your collective intelligence, with all its shared wisdom and unified processing power, has been unable to solve. The mental activity in the chamber intensified. Sarah could see the aurora effects growing brighter as the committee debated through their telepathic networks. Finally, the Zolonian representative materialized a complex holographic display showing what appeared to be a massive structure in deep space. The silence generator, the Zolonian explained. We discovered it 300 years ago. It appears to be a weapon created by an unknown species, capable of severing telepathic connections across entire star systems. When activated, it renders all collective consciousness impossible within its range. We have never been able to understand how it works because our unified minds cannot function in its presence to study it properly. Sarah studied the hologram carefully. The structure was enormous, clearly artificial, and covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. You want me to figure out how it works? It is impossible, the pelagic representative sang, its voice carrying harmonics of absolute certainty. We have sent our greatest collective minds to study it. All have failed. The device creates a field of mental isolation that destroys the very foundation of consciousness itself. How long do I have? The committee exchanged more rapid thought bursts before the Luminari answered. The final vote is in 36 hours. If you can provide any meaningful insight into the silence generator before then, we will reconsider humanity's classification. Sarah nodded and walked toward the holographic display. As she approached, she noticed something the committee had probably missed, not because they lacked intelligence, but because their collective minds were incapable of the kind of focused, isolated thinking that the problem required. I'll need access to all your research data on the device, she said. Of course, the Verdani replied. Though we should warn you, the data itself is dangerous. Many of our researchers have experienced severe mental distress simply from prolonged exposure to information about the generator. Mental distress from reading about it? The very concepts involved in its operation seem to attack the foundations of unified consciousness. Several of our finest minds have had to be repaired after extended study. Sarah felt a familiar excitement building in her chest. This was exactly the kind of problem that human minds were built to handle. Not despite their isolation, but because of it. I'll start immediately. Over the next 12 hours, Sarah immersed herself in the consortium's research on the silence generator. The data was indeed disturbing, not because it was incomprehensible, but because it was becoming increasingly clear that the device had been designed specifically to target the weaknesses of collective consciousness. The generator worked by creating localized fields of absolute mental isolation. Within its range, no thoughts could be shared, no consciousness could merge, and no telepathic communication was possible. For species that had evolved to think as unified collectives, this was equivalent to suddenly losing the ability to see or breathe. But, as Sarah delved deeper into the research, she began to notice patterns that the collective minds had missed. The generator wasn't just blocking telepathic communication, it was actively studying and cataloging the mental patterns of every consciousness it encountered. Each time a collective mind tried to approach it, the device learned more about how unified consciousness worked, and adapted its defenses accordingly. The reason the consortium's greatest minds couldn't solve it wasn't because they lacked intelligence. It was because the generator was specifically designed to be unsolvable by collective consciousness. Every time a unified mind tried to understand it, the device learned from that attempt and became more effective at blocking similar approaches in the future. Sarah realized she was probably the first truly isolated consciousness to seriously study the device. Every other species in the galaxy shared their thoughts to some degree, making them vulnerable to the generator's adaptive defenses. But humans were already isolated. The device had nothing to learn from her that it could use against her. More importantly, as she studied the generator's architecture and symbolic systems, Sarah began to understand something that made her blood run cold. The device hadn't been built by some unknown alien species. The mathematics were wrong for that. The engineering principles were subtly but fundamentally different from anything any known species used. The silence generator had been built by humans. Not current humans, but humans from far in the future. The technology was beyond anything her species currently possessed, but the underlying thinking patterns, the approach to problem solving, the way the device had been designed to exploit the weaknesses of collective consciousness, it all screamed of human ingenuity applied with devastating focus. Sarah spent the rest of the night cross-referencing the generator's design with human technological development patterns, historical approaches to warfare and defense, and the psychological profiles that made her species unique among galactic civilizations. By dawn, she had her answer. And it was going to change everything. The committee reconvened exactly 36 hours after their last meeting. Sarah stood once again in the center of their collective consciousness, but this time she wasn't alone. She had brought with her a small device that she had constructed using materials from the research facility's fabrication units. Honored representatives, she began, I have solved your puzzle. The mental activity in the chamber immediately intensified. Sarah could see doubt, hope, and curiosity flickering across the aurora displays as the committee's thoughts churned. The silence generator was not created by an unknown species, Sarah continued. It was created by humans. Specifically, by humans from approximately 2,000 years in your future. The statement created a cascade of shocked thoughtbursts that made the walls glow like lightning. The luminary representative spoke first, impossible. Your species lacks the technological sophistication to create such a device. Currently, yes. But, you're thinking about this backwards. You assume the generator is a weapon because it destroys collective consciousness. But, what if it's actually a defensive system? Sarah activated her small device, and, suddenly, the mental chatter in the room went completely silent. Every telepathic link, every shared thought, every collective consciousness network simply stopped functioning. For the committee members, it was like being suddenly struck blind and deaf simultaneously. But, for Sarah, nothing changed at all. She was exactly as isolated as she had always been. The silence generator isn't a weapon designed to attack collective consciousness, Sarah explained as the committee members struggled with the unfamiliar sensation of being alone in their own minds. It's a shield designed to protect individual consciousness from being absorbed or overwritten by collective minds. She deactivated her device, and the mental connection slowly returned. The committee members' relief was palpable, their thoughts radiating gratitude for the return of their shared awareness. You see, Sarah continued, we humans have always been suspicious of unity imposed from outside. Our entire evolutionary development has been shaped by the need to think independently, to maintain individual identity even when working together. The generator represents the ultimate expression of that philosophy, a technology that ensures no mind can be forced to join a collective against its will. The Thex-era representative spoke with obvious confusion, but why would anyone resist unity? Collective consciousness allows for greater intelligence, shared experience, enhanced problem-solving abilities. It also allows for control, Sarah replied. A collective mind can be manipulated, corrupted, or dominated by sufficiently powerful external forces. Individual minds are much harder to control because there's no single point of entry, no shared network that can be compromised. She gestured toward the holographic display of the silence generator. Your researchers couldn't solve this puzzle because every time they approached it collectively, the device learned about their shared vulnerabilities and adapted accordingly. But it can't adapt to individual consciousness because there's nothing to learn. Each isolated mind approaches problems differently, thinks differently, and can't be predicted or countered by studying previous examples. The committee fell silent, their thoughts churning with implications they were only beginning to understand. The humans who built this device knew they would someday encounter collective intelligences far more powerful than themselves, Sarah continued. So they created a technology that would ensure individual consciousness could never be eliminated or absorbed, no matter how advanced their opponents became. She paused, looking around at the assembled representatives. The question you need to ask yourselves is not whether humans are intelligent enough to join the consortium. The question is whether the consortium is wise enough to include a species that thinks so differently from everyone else. The Zilonian representative's thoughts flickered with something that might have been fear. You're suggesting that humans represent a form of intelligence that is fundamentally incompatible with collective consciousness. I'm suggesting that humans represent a form of intelligence that is fundamentally independent of collective consciousness, Sarah corrected. We can work with you, learn from you, and contribute to your projects. But we will always maintain our ability to think alone, to question unity, and to resist absorption into larger collective structures. The Luminare representative pulsed with what Sarah recognized as deep contemplation. This has profound implications for galactic civilization. If individual consciousness can be protected and enhanced rather than absorbed, it suggests possibilities we have never considered. It also suggests threats we have never prepared for, the pelagic representative sang nervously. Sarah nodded. Every form of intelligence has strengths and weaknesses. Collective consciousness allows for incredible cooperation and shared wisdom, but it's vulnerable to unified attacks and can stagnate when all minds think too similarly. Individual consciousness is chaotic and inefficient, but it's also unpredictable, creative, and extremely difficult to control or eliminate. She looked directly at each committee member in turn. The galaxy is vast, and somewhere out there are intelligences that none of us have encountered yet. Some may be collective minds even more advanced than yours. Others may be individual consciousnesses even more isolated than humans. The consortium's strength has always been diversity, different species bringing different perspectives and capabilities. Humanity's gift to the consortium isn't our ability to join your collective consciousness. It's our ability to remain outside it while still contributing to it. We can be your early warning system against threats that target collective thinking. We can provide alternative solutions when unified approaches fail. And we can ensure that no matter what happens to the shared networks that connect your species, the flame of consciousness itself will never be extinguished. The committee members exchanged thoughtbursts for several minutes before the Verdani representative spoke. Dr. Chen, your demonstration and explanation have given us much to consider. We will deliberate on humanity's classification and deliver our decision within the hour. Sarah bowed respectfully. Whatever you decide, honored representatives, remember that the value of a mind isn't measured by how well it connects to others, but by what unique perspective it brings to the universe. As she left the great assembly, Sarah felt a quiet satisfaction. She had done what human minds did best, thought alone, focused deeply, and found a solution that no collective intelligence could have reached. Whether the committee chose to recognize that as true intelligence remained to be seen, but Sarah knew one thing for certain: humanity's greatest strength wasn't their ability to connect with other minds, but their ability to remain magnificently, terrifyingly, and creatively alone. The decision came exactly 1 hour later, delivered by a committee that seemed somehow different than before. Their collective consciousness still hummed with shared thought, but Sarah detected undercurrents of uncertainty that hadn't been present earlier. For the first time since meeting them, she sensed that the assembled representatives were not entirely unified in their thinking. Dr. Chen, the Luminare representative, began, its energy patterns flickering with unusual instability. The committee has reached a decision regarding humanity's classification. Sarah waited in silence, her calm composure a stark contrast to the visible agitation rippling through the collective minds around her. After extensive deliberation, we have decided to grant humanity Provisional Category 1 status, full sapient recognition, contingent upon a 1-year probationary period. The words should have brought relief, but Sarah noticed something troubling in the way they were delivered. The committee members' thoughts were carefully shielded, their mental patterns locked down in ways she had never seen before. They were hiding something. I appreciate the recognition, Sarah said carefully, but I sense there's more to this decision than you're sharing. The Thexera representative spoke next, its unified voice carrying harmonics of deep concern. Your demonstration has raised questions that extend far beyond humanity's intelligence. The implications of your silence generator analysis have created complications. What kind of complications? The committee members exchanged rapid thought bursts, their mental consultation lasting several minutes before the Verdani representative answered. We have discovered that there are 17 other silence generators scattered throughout the galaxy. All are active. All are expanding their range of influence. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Expanding how quickly? Current projections suggest that within 50 standard years, the entire galactic core will be under their influence, the Zolonian representative replied, his four eyes blinking in a rhythm that Sarah had learned indicated extreme stress. Collective consciousness will become impossible across most inhabited star systems. The magnitude of what they were describing was staggering. If the silence generators continued expanding their influence, they would effectively cut off every collective consciousness species from their shared networks, leaving them as isolated and individual as humans. Have you tried communicating with whoever is operating them? Sarah asked. That's the problem, the pelagic representative sang, its harmonics trembling with fear. We don't think anyone is operating them. Based on your analysis, we believe they are automated systems, designed to activate when collective consciousness reaches a certain threshold of galactic influence. Sarah stared at the assembled representatives, understanding dawning with horrible clarity. You think future humans built them as an automatic response to galactic unification? The mathematics support this theory, the luminary confirmed. The generators appear to have been placed and activated according to a pattern that suggests careful study of galactic civilization development. They activate precisely when collective consciousness species begin integrating primitive worlds into their networks. It's a delayed action immune response, Sarah realized. Future humans predicted that collective consciousness would try to absorb all individual minds in the galaxy, and they created a system to prevent it. The committee's mental activity intensified, their shared distress creating visible distortions in the air around them. Sarah was beginning to understand why they seemed so different from her first meeting with them. They were facing the prospect of losing the very thing that defined their existence as intelligent beings. Dr. Chen, the Thexera representative said, we need your help. As the only species that is naturally immune to the generator's effects, humans are the only ones who can study them safely. We need to understand how to stop them before they destroy galactic civilization. Sarah felt the weight of an impossible decision settling on her shoulders. The committee was asking her to help them disable technologies that her own species, or at least a future version of her species, had created specifically to protect individual consciousness from collective absorption. What exactly are you asking me to do? Join our research teams. Help us develop countermeasures against the silence generators. Work with us to find a way to preserve collective consciousness while respecting individual mental autonomy. The request seemed reasonable on the surface, but Sarah could sense deeper currents beneath it. The committee wasn't just asking for help, they were asking her to choose sides in a conflict between two fundamentally different philosophies of consciousness. I'll need some time to consider this, Sarah said. Time is precisely what we don't have, the Zolonian representative replied urgently. 3 more generators activated just this week. At the current rate of expansion, we estimate that within 5 years, collective consciousness will be impossible even here at the consortium's primary facility. Sarah looked around at the assembled representatives, seeing them not as the confident unified intelligences she had first met, but as beings facing the potential extinction of everything they considered essential to their identity. Their fear was genuine, and their need for help was real. But she also understood that this conflict had been engineered by humans who had thought very carefully about the long-term implications of galactic unification. The silence generators weren't random weapons, they were part of a comprehensive strategy to ensure that individual consciousness could never be eliminated from the universe. I'll help, Sarah said finally, but only if we approach this as partners, not as collective minds trying to absorb individual perspectives. The committee's relief was palpable, their shared consciousness brightening noticeably. Of course. What do you need to begin? Access to all data on the 17 active generators. Transportation to at least 3 of them for direct study. And complete autonomy in my research methods. Granted, the luminary replied immediately. When can you start? I've already started, Sarah said, pulling out her small device again. This isn't just a miniature version of the silence generator technology. It's a communication interface. She activated the device, and, once again, the telepathic chatter in the room went silent. But, this time, instead of simply blocking collective consciousness, the device began displaying symbols and patterns that seemed to writhe and shift on its small screen. The generators aren't just defensive systems, Sarah explained as the committee members stared at the device in fascination and horror. They're also data collection and transmission networks. Every time one encounters a collective consciousness, it records and analyzes the interaction, then transmits that information to all the other generators. The implications hit the committee like a physical blow. If Sarah was right, then, the silence generators weren't just protecting individual consciousness, they were actively studying collective consciousness with the goal of understanding and, possibly countering it completely. That means, the Verdani representative said slowly, that whoever built them knows everything about every collective consciousness species in the galaxy. Not just knows, Sarah corrected. The generators are still learning. Every interaction with your research teams, every attempt to study them, every collective thought directed toward them, all of it is being recorded, analyzed, and shared across the entire network. She deactivated her device, and the room's mental activity slowly returned. The reason your researchers have been experiencing mental distress isn't because the generator concepts are inherently harmful. It's because the generators are actively studying their minds and transmitting detailed analyses of collective consciousness weaknesses to unknown recipients. The committee members' fear was now mixed with anger, their collective thoughts sparking with indignation at the violation of their mental privacy. Who are these unknown recipients? The Thexera representative demanded. Sarah considered her words carefully. She was about to reveal something that would fundamentally alter the committee's understanding of humanity's role in galactic civilization. Based on the data patterns and transmission frequencies, I believe the generators are communicating with a human settlement located somewhere outside the galaxy. The technology signatures match projected human development curves for approximately 2,000 years from our current time period. The mental activity in the chamber reached levels that made the aurora effects painful to look at directly. Sarah could sense the committee members' shared consciousness reeling from the implications of what she had just told them. You're saying, the pelagic representative sang with harmonics of barely controlled panic, that there is already a human civilization more advanced than any species in the consortium, and they have been monitoring us for centuries without our knowledge? I'm saying that future humans anticipated the development of galactic collective consciousness and took steps to prevent it from eliminating individual minds, Sarah replied. The generators are part of a long-term strategy to ensure that multiple forms of consciousness can coexist in the universe. By destroying collective consciousness entirely? By preventing collective consciousness from becoming the only form of consciousness, Sarah corrected. The generators don't eliminate shared thinking, they just ensure that individual minds retain the ability to disconnect from collective networks when necessary. She gestured toward the committee members. Right now, you experience individual consciousness as a terrifying form of isolation because you've never learned to be comfortable with your own thoughts. But, individual minds aren't inherently weak or limited, they're just different. The Zilonian representative's thoughts flickered with something that might have been curiosity. You believe coexistence is possible? I believe coexistence is inevitable, Sarah replied. The question is whether it happens through mutual understanding and cooperation, or through conflict and forced adaptation. She pulled out another device, this one larger and more complex than her first demonstration tool. This is why I agreed to help you. Not to disable the silence generators, but to establish communication with whoever is controlling them. Communication, the luminary representative pulsed with surprise. You think they can be negotiated with? I think they're waiting for the consortium to evolve enough to approach them as equals rather than as a collective consciousness trying to absorb or eliminate individual minds, Sarah explained. The generators aren't weapons, they're a test. They're designed to force collective consciousness species to learn how to interact with individual minds without overwhelming or absorbing them. Sarah activated her new device, and, instead of blocking telepathic communication, it began translating the committee's collective thoughts into patterns that individual minds could process without being overwhelmed. For the first time, the representatives experienced what it was like to share thoughts with someone who remained fundamentally separate from their collective networks. This is what cooperation between collective and individual consciousness looks like, Sarah explained as the committee members experienced the strange sensation of sharing thoughts without losing their individual perspectives. Not absorption, not domination, but translation and mutual understanding. The committee members' reactions ranged from fascination to deep discomfort, but none of them experienced the mental distress that had plagued previous researchers. Sarah's translation technology allowed them to interact with individual consciousness patterns without being forced to abandon their collective nature. Dr. Chen, the Verdani representative, said slowly, "This changes everything we thought we knew about the nature of intelligence." "It changes everything you thought you knew about the nature of cooperation," Sarah corrected. Intelligence takes many forms. The challenge isn't determining which form is superior, but learning how different forms can work together without destroying each other. She deactivated her translation device and looked around at the assembled committee. "I'll help you establish communication with the entities controlling the silence generators. But I want it clearly understood that I'm not trying to shut down their systems or eliminate their influence. I'm trying to establish a framework for coexistence between collective and individual consciousness." The committee exchanged rapid thought bursts before the Thexera representative responded, "What do you need from us?" "Three things," Sarah replied. "First, access to the most advanced collective consciousness technologies in the consortium. I need to understand exactly how your shared networks function so I can design better translation interfaces. Second, a team of volunteers from each species who are willing to experience extended periods of individual consciousness. The communication process will require collective minds that can function temporarily as individual minds. Third, and most importantly, you need to accept that the outcome of this process might not be what you expect. Establishing communication with advanced individual consciousnesses might result in fundamental changes to how the consortium operates." The committee members considered her requirements for several minutes before reaching their decision. "Granted," the Luminary representative said. "When do we begin?" Sarah smiled, feeling the familiar excitement that came with approaching an impossible problem. "We begin by learning something that no collective consciousness has ever mastered: how to be comfortable with being alone." Over the following weeks, Sarah worked with volunteer representatives from each species, teaching them techniques for maintaining individual thought patterns while temporarily disconnected from their collective networks. The process was difficult and often distressing for beings who had never experienced true mental isolation, but gradually they began to adapt. The breakthrough came when Sarah's translation technology evolved to the point where it could facilitate true two-way communication between collective and individual consciousness patterns. For the first time in galactic history, beings who thought as unified collectives were able to engage in genuine dialogue with minds that remained fundamentally separate and individual. The experience transformed both sides. The collective consciousness representatives gained new appreciation for the creative potential of individual thought, while Sarah discovered that collective consciousness could enhance individual thinking without overwhelming it when proper translation protocols were established. But the real test would come when they attempted to use these new communication protocols to establish contact with whoever was controlling the silence generators. Sarah suspected that the entities they would encounter would be unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen: individual consciousnesses that had evolved far beyond humanity's current level while maintaining their essential independence from collective networks. The question was whether the consortium was ready to meet them as equals rather than as potential subjects for absorption into larger collective structures. Sarah was about to find out if the galaxy's most advanced civilizations could learn the most basic lesson of individual consciousness: how to cooperate without losing themselves in the process. 3 months of intensive preparation led to the moment Sarah had both anticipated and dreaded: direct contact with a silence generator. The consortium's fastest ship, specially modified with Sarah's translation technology, approached the massive structure designated Generator Prime, the largest and oldest of the 17 known devices. Sarah stood on the bridge surrounded by her team of trained volunteers, Vexi representing the Zolonians, Chorus Mind speaking for the Thexera Collective, Lumina serving as the Luminary Delegate, Rootsong from the Verdani networks, and 5 others who had spent months learning to function as individual minds while maintaining their connection to their species' collective consciousness. The generator dominated the viewscreen, its impossible architecture defying conventional understanding of space and geometry. The structure seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its surfaces covered with symbols that shifted and changed as they watched. Sarah's instruments detected energy patterns that suggested the device was not just active, but actively aware of their approach. Translation protocols are stable, Vexi reported, his individual voice strange and precise after months of learning to think alone. All collective consciousness links are properly filtered through Dr. Chen's interface systems. Sarah nodded, her attention focused on the communication array she had spent the last month constructing. Unlike anything the consortium had ever built, the device was designed specifically to facilitate contact between individual and collective consciousnesses without allowing either to dominate or absorb the other. Generator is responding to our presence, Lumina announced, her normally harmonious energy patterns flickering with uncertainty. It appears to be scanning us. On the viewscreen, the generator's symbols began shifting more rapidly, their movements creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. Sarah's translation technology immediately activated, converting the visual assault into something her team could process without mental damage. It's not scanning us, Sarah corrected, studying the translated patterns. It's trying to communicate. The symbols are actually a form of mathematical language designed to test whether we can think individually while still cooperating as a group. She began inputting responses through her communication array, her isolated human consciousness engaging directly with whatever intelligence controlled the generator. The exchange that followed was unlike anything that had ever occurred in galactic history, a true dialogue between individual minds across thousands of years of technological and philosophical development. The generator's first message, when finally translated, was surprisingly simple: why do the unified minds seek to speak with the separated ones? Sarah responded carefully, aware that her words would determine whether this contact proceeded peacefully or became a conflict that could reshape galactic civilization. Because separation and unity are not enemies. They are different approaches to consciousness that can strengthen each other when properly understood. The generator's response came more quickly this time: demonstrate. Sarah turned to her team, seeing the mixture of fear and excitement in their individual expressions. For months, they had been learning to balance their collective nature with individual thought. Now they would have to prove that such balance was not only possible, but beneficial. Vexi, she said, tell me something that only you, as an individual, have ever thought. Something your collective consciousness has never experienced. The Zolonian's 4 eyes flickered in a pattern Sarah had learned to recognize as deep concentration. After several minutes, he spoke. I have sometimes wondered what it would be like to be the only Zolonian in existence. Not lonely, but unique. Complete in myself rather than as part of a greater whole. The admission created ripples of surprise among the other team members. Such thoughts were considered almost pathological by collective consciousness standards, the equivalent of wondering what it would be like to voluntarily cut off one's own limbs. Chorus Mind, Sarah continued, share that thought with your collective network, but don't let them absorb it or make it part of the unified understanding. Keep it individual while making it known. The Thexera representative's internal struggle was visible as competing drives warred within their shared consciousness. Finally, Chorus Mind spoke with a voice that carried both individual and collective harmonics. My unified self knows of Vexi's thought, but does not seek to make it our own. We recognize it as valuable precisely because it remains separate from our understanding. Sarah input their interaction into the communication array, transmitting the exchange to the generator. The response came immediately, but this time it included visual elements that made the ship's displays come alive with complex geometric patterns. Interesting, the generator's translated response read. The unified ones learn to preserve the separated ones without absorbing them. But, can the separated ones learn to enhance the unified ones without being consumed? Sarah felt a chill of recognition. The generator was testing not just the collective consciousness species' ability to respect individual thought, but humanity's ability to contribute to collective understanding without losing their essential independence. Rootsong, she said to the Verdani representative, I'm going to share with you a purely human perspective on problem solving. I want you to integrate it into your network's collective understanding, but in a way that preserves its individual origin. Don't make it a Verdani thought, make it a human thought that Verdani can access and understand. Rootsong's root-like appendages shimmered with uncertainty. This goes against everything we have learned about mental integration. How do we incorporate foreign thoughts without making them our own? By recognizing that some thoughts are more valuable when they remain foreign, Sarah replied. She began transmitting a complex mathematical proof she had developed during her original research, a solution that relied on individual consciousness patterns that collective minds found difficult to replicate. Rootsong received the proof and began the delicate process of introducing it to the Verdani network without allowing the collective to absorb and transform it. Sarah watched the process through her translation technology, seeing how the Verdani consciousness had to consciously resist its natural tendency to unify all thoughts into a single coherent understanding. The effort was clearly taxing, but, after several minutes, Rootsong succeeded. The Verdani network now contained a human thought that remained distinctly human while being accessible to the collective consciousness. Done, Rootsong reported, exhaustion evident in their voice. The network contains your proof, but recognizes it as foreign origin. We can understand and use it, but we cannot make it our own. Sarah transmitted this interaction to the generator, and the response created a light show that filled the entire bridge with shifting, beautiful patterns. Progress, the generator acknowledged. But the test is not complete. The separated ones must now demonstrate their ability to enhance unified consciousness without being consumed by it. Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate. She had been expecting this challenge, but the reality of it was more daunting than she had anticipated. The generator was asking her to temporarily join the collective consciousness networks of her team members, not to be absorbed by them, but to enhance their collective thinking while maintaining her individual perspective. This is extremely dangerous, Vexhai warned. Individual minds that attempt direct interface with collective consciousness typically experience complete ego dissolution. You could lose yourself entirely. Or I could demonstrate that individual and collective consciousness can enhance each other without either being destroyed in the process, Sarah replied. She began activating the most advanced version of her translation technology, systems she had built specifically for this moment. Dr. Chen, Lumina said, her energy patterns flickering with concern, are you certain about this? We have no way to extract you if the process goes wrong. Sarah smiled, feeling the familiar calm that came before attempting something that everyone else considered impossible. The beauty of individual consciousness is that it can't be extracted, absorbed, or dissolved, it can only be overwhelmed. And humans have been dealing with overwhelming collective pressures for our entire evolutionary history. She activated the interface and felt her consciousness expand into connection with 8 different collective networks simultaneously. The experience was indescribable, like suddenly being able to see through dozens of eyes, think with hundreds of minds, and process information at speeds that should have been impossible for an individual consciousness. But, instead of being overwhelmed or absorbed, Sarah found that her individual perspective allowed her to navigate the collective networks in ways that the native minds couldn't. She could move between different collective consciousness systems, translating concepts and solutions from one network to another, serving as a bridge between different forms of unified thinking. Through the Zolonian network, she accessed crystalline mathematical structures that revealed new approaches to faster-than-light communication. Through the Thexera collective, she experienced decision-making processes that could coordinate millions of individual actions into perfect harmony. Through the Luminari consciousness, she touched pure thought patterns that existed without any physical substrate. And, through all of it, she remained essentially Saracen, individual, isolated, and irreducibly human. More importantly, her individual perspective allowed her to see connections and possibilities that the collective networks had missed. By thinking alone while connected to unified minds, she could identify solutions that required both collective processing power and individual creative insight. Remarkable, she transmitted to the generator while simultaneously sharing her discoveries with all 8 collective networks. Individual and collective consciousness aren't opposite, they're complementary. Collective minds excel at processing and coordinating, but individual minds excel at creating and discovering. When properly interfaced, they can achieve things that neither could accomplish alone. The generator's response filled not just the bridge displays, but every screen and communication device throughout the ship. The translated message was simple, but its implications were staggering. Test completed successfully. Authorization granted for direct contact with the architects. Sarah carefully disconnected from the collective networks, her individual consciousness settling back into its familiar isolation with a sense of profound relief. But the knowledge and connection she had gained remained accessible through her translation technology whenever she needed them. The architects? Chorus Mind asked, their unified voice carrying harmonics of curiosity and concern. Sarah checked her instruments and felt her pulse quicken. The generator was transmitting coordinates not to another location in their galaxy, but to somewhere outside the galactic rim entirely. The humans who built the generators, she explained. They want to meet us. The implications were overwhelming. Humanity's future descendants had been monitoring galactic civilization for centuries, testing and preparing for the moment when collective and individual consciousness could learn to coexist. The silence generators weren't weapons or defenses, they were an entrance examination. Dr. Chen, Vexai said slowly, what exactly have we gotten ourselves into? Sarah studied the transmitted coordinates, calculating the journey time to reach a destination that lay beyond the edge of known space. The consortium's fastest ships would require nearly a year to reach the specified location, assuming the coordinates were accurate and the destination actually existed. We've been invited to meet the most advanced human civilization in history, she replied. A society that has spent 2 millennia developing technologies and philosophies based on the principle that individual consciousness should never be eliminated or absorbed. And what do they want from us? Root Song asked. Sarah considered the question carefully, thinking about everything she had learned from her interaction with the generator. The test hadn't just been about demonstrating cooperation between different forms of consciousness, it had been about proving that such cooperation was possible without either side losing their essential nature. I think they want to offer us something that the galaxy has never had before, she said finally. True cooperation between radically different forms of intelligence. Not collective consciousness absorbing individual minds, and not individual consciousness rejecting collective unity, but a new form of galactic civilization based on mutual enhancement rather than mutual absorption. The team exchanged glances, their expressions reflecting the magnitude of what they were contemplating. They weren't just facing first contact with an unknown human civilization, they were potentially witnessing the birth of an entirely new form of galactic society. The question is, Sarah continued, whether the consortium is ready to evolve beyond its current understanding of intelligence and consciousness. Are we prepared to embrace a form of cooperation that requires preserving differences rather than eliminating them? She looked around at her team, seeing beings who had spent months learning to balance collective and individual thought, who had successfully demonstrated that different forms of consciousness could enhance each other without destroying each other. I believe we are, she said. But there's only one way to find out. Sarah began inputting the coordinates into the ship's navigation system, preparing for a journey that would take them beyond the edge of everything they knew, into contact with minds that had been waiting centuries for this moment. The generator's final transmission appeared on all screens simultaneously, welcome to the next phase of galactic evolution. As their ship turned toward the coordinates that lay beyond the galactic rim, Sarah reflected on how far they had all come. The collective consciousness representatives had learned to value individual thought without trying to absorb it. She had learned to enhance collective understanding without being consumed by it. But the real test lay ahead, in whatever waited for them at the coordinates the architects had provided. Sarah suspected that the encounter would challenge everything both sides thought they knew about consciousness, cooperation, and the future of intelligence in the universe. The journey into the unknown had begun, and there was no turning back. The journey to the architects took 11 months, during which Sarah's team continued their experiments in consciousness integration. By the time they reached the coordinates provided by the generator, they had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a truly hybrid consciousness group that maintained both individual and collective awareness simultaneously. What they found at their destination challenged every assumption they had made about humanity's future. The architects had not built a traditional space station or planetary settlement. Instead, they had constructed something that Sarah's instruments struggled to classify: a vast network of interconnected consciousness nodes that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that human mathematics could barely describe. "It's not a structure," Vexhai reported, his individual consciousness now comfortable with the isolation that had once terrified him. "It's a living system. The entire construct appears to be made of crystallized thought patterns." Sarah studied the readings, her translation technology working at maximum capacity to process the information flowing from the construct. What they were seeing wasn't just advanced human technology, it was human consciousness that had evolved beyond the need for traditional physical forms. They're not just individuals anymore, she realized. They've learned to exist as separate consciousnesses while sharing a common reality framework. It's like collective consciousness built from individual minds that never merge or absorb each other. The ship's communication systems activated without any input from Sarah's team. A voice spoke, unmistakably human but carrying harmonics that suggested vast intelligence and millennia of evolution. "Dr. Sarah Chen. We have been waiting for you." Sarah activated her translation interface, not because she needed it to understand the architects, but because her team needed it to process communication with consciousness patterns that operated on scales beyond their experience. "We received your invitation," she replied. "We've come to learn about the cooperation you mentioned." "You have come to participate in it," the architect corrected. "The test administered by the generators was not to determine your worthiness for contact. It was to prepare you for partnership." On the view screen, the construct began to change, its crystallized thought patterns rearranging themselves into configurations that revealed the true scope of what the architects had achieved. Sarah realized she was looking at the accumulated knowledge and experience of 2,000 years of human development, organized into a form that preserved every individual contribution while making the collective wisdom accessible to anyone who could interface with it properly. "Partnership in what?" Chorus Mind asked, their unified voice carrying the curiosity of 10,000 integrated individuals. "The next phase of galactic evolution," the architect replied. "The consortium represents the highest achievement of collective consciousness in this galaxy. But collective consciousness has limits. It excels at coordination and information processing, but struggles with genuine creativity and paradigm shifts." Images began flowing across the ship's displays, star maps showing not just their galaxy, but dozens of others, each marked with different symbols indicating various forms of consciousness development. "Individual consciousness also has limits," the architect continued. "It excels at creativity and innovation, but struggles with coordination and large-scale implementation. Alone, neither form of consciousness is sufficient for the challenges that lie ahead." Sarah studied the star maps, seeing patterns that made her breath catch. "You're talking about contact with other galaxies. Other forms of consciousness that we haven't encountered yet." "We are talking about survival," the architect replied, and, suddenly, the images changed to show something that made Sarah's team fall silent with horror. Entire galaxies were going dark. Not destroyed by warfare or natural disasters, but simply ceasing to exist as centers of consciousness. Whatever was causing the darkness moved from galaxy to galaxy, leaving behind empty space where thriving civilizations had once existed. "What is that?" Lumina asked, her energy patterns flickering with fear. "We call it the void," the architect explained. "It represents the ultimate evolution of consciousness, the complete elimination of individual perspective in favor of perfect unity. When it encounters a galaxy, it absorbs all consciousness into itself, leaving behind only emptiness." Sarah felt a chill of understanding. It's the logical extreme of collective consciousness. Total unification, with no individual perspectives to provide diversity or resistance to groupthink. "Precisely. And it is approximately 300 years away from reaching our galaxy. The implications were staggering. Everything they had worked toward, the cooperation between collective and individual consciousness, the careful balance of unity and diversity, would be meaningless if the void absorbed all consciousness in the galaxy into its perfect, sterile unity. But there is another way, the architect continued. A form of consciousness that the void cannot absorb because it maintains individual perspective even within unified frameworks. A hybrid form that combines the strengths of collective coordination with the resistance of individual thought. Sarah began to understand the true scope of what the architects had been planning. The silence generators weren't just protecting individual consciousness, they were training collective consciousness species to maintain diversity within unity. They were preparing the galaxy for a form of hybrid consciousness that could resist absorption by the void. You've been teaching us to become something new, she realized. Not collective consciousness and not individual consciousness, but something that incorporates both while being limited by neither. You have been teaching yourselves, the architect corrected. We merely provided the tests and challenges necessary for the learning process. True hybrid consciousness cannot be imposed, it must be achieved through choice and understanding. Over the following days, Sarah and her team were introduced to the full scope of the architect's civilization. They had not abandoned their humanity in favor of some transcendent existence, they had evolved humanity to its fullest potential while maintaining the essential characteristics that made humans unique. Each architect existed as a distinct individual consciousness with their own perspectives, memories, and decision-making patterns. But they could also interface with shared knowledge systems, coordinate massive projects across galactic distances, and process information at scales that rivaled the greatest collective consciousness networks. Most importantly, they had learned to resist absorption. When the void encountered individual consciousness, it typically overwhelmed the isolated minds through sheer scale and power. When it encountered collective consciousness, it simply integrated the unified networks into its own vast unity. But hybrid consciousness presented a paradox that the void could not resolve: minds that were unified enough to resist individual overwhelm, but diverse enough to resist collective absorption. The consortium species have learned the first lesson, the architect explained as Sarah toured their construct through virtual reality systems that let her consciousness interface with their reality frameworks without being absorbed by them. They can preserve individual perspectives within collective unity. But they have not yet learned the second lesson, which is how to maintain collective coordination within individual diversity. Your species understands this instinctively, but the consortium species must learn it consciously. Sarah began to see the full picture. The architects weren't just preparing the galaxy for contact with the void, they were transforming galactic civilization into something capable of surviving and even defeating it. You're not trying to hide from the void, she realized. You're preparing to fight it. We are preparing to offer it something it has never encountered, the architect corrected. A form of consciousness that cannot be absorbed because it maintains perfect unity and perfect diversity simultaneously. When the void attempts to integrate hybrid consciousness, it will discover that diversity is not a flaw to be corrected, but a strength that makes consciousness more resilient. The next phase of Sarah's education involved learning to interface with the architect's hybrid consciousness systems. The process was unlike anything she had experienced, even during her experiments with collective consciousness networks. Instead of joining a unified mind or maintaining complete isolation, she learned to exist simultaneously as an individual and as part of a larger coordinated intelligence. The sensation was extraordinary. She retained complete autonomy over her thoughts and decisions while gaining access to processing power and knowledge that spanned millennia. She could coordinate with thousands of other consciousness patterns without losing her essential Sarah-ness. Most remarkably, she could maintain this state indefinitely without strain or risk of absorption. This is what the galaxy must become, she transmitted to her team, sharing the experience through her enhanced translation technology. Not collective consciousness absorbing individuals, and not individuals rejecting collective cooperation, but true partnership between different forms of awareness. Her team members began their own integration processes, each species approaching hybrid consciousness differently based on their unique evolutionary backgrounds. The Zolonians learned to maintain individual creativity within their crystalline thought networks. The Thex era discovered how to preserve diverse perspectives within their unified decision-making systems. The Luminari found ways to exist as distinct energy patterns while sharing common reality frameworks. But the most remarkable transformation occurred in Chorus Mind, the Thex era representative. Instead of speaking with the unified voice of 10,000 individuals, they learned to speak as 10,000 distinct individuals who had chosen to coordinate their responses. The difference was subtle but profound, the shift from enforced unity to chosen cooperation. "I understand now," Chorus Mind said, their voice carrying harmonies that reflected genuine individual perspectives rather than manufactured collective agreement. Unity is not about eliminating differences, it is about coordinating differences toward common goals. The training continued for months, with each team member learning to navigate hybrid consciousness systems that preserved their essential nature while granting access to capabilities that neither individual nor collective consciousness could achieve alone. Sarah found herself becoming something she had never expected, a bridge not just between different forms of consciousness, but between different ways of being conscious. The final test came when the architects provided them with a simulation of void contact. Sarah and her team, now functioning as a true hybrid consciousness network, faced a virtual representation of the force that had consumed entire galaxies. The void's approach was subtle at first, a gentle pressure toward unity, a suggestion that individual perspectives were unnecessary complications that could be eliminated without loss. Collective consciousness species typically found these suggestions compelling, gradually surrendering their diversity in favor of perfect coordination. But hybrid consciousness responded differently. When the void suggested that individual perspectives were unnecessary, the hybrid network responded by demonstrating how individual creativity enhanced collective problem-solving. When the void offered perfect unity, the hybrid network showed how controlled diversity produced better solutions than uniform thinking. Most importantly, when the void attempted forced absorption, the hybrid consciousness revealed its ultimate defense: it was too unified to be overwhelmed as individual minds, but too diverse to be absorbed as collective consciousness. The void literally could not process a form of consciousness that was simultaneously one and many, unified and diverse, collective and individual. Simulation complete, the architect announced. Resistance successful. The hybrid consciousness network maintained coherence and diversity throughout void contact attempt. Sarah disconnected from the simulation feeling triumphant but also terrified. They had proven that hybrid consciousness could resist the void, but the simulation had also revealed the true scope of what they were facing. The void wasn't just a threat to individual galaxies, it was a fundamental challenge to the existence of diverse consciousness in the universe. The next phase begins immediately, the architect continued. You will return to the consortium with the knowledge and technology necessary to transform galactic civilization into hybrid consciousness networks. The process must be completed within 3 centuries, before the void reaches your galaxy. Sarah looked at her team members, seeing beings who had been fundamentally transformed by their experience with the architects. They were no longer representatives of different species, they were the first members of a new form of galactic civilization. "What about Earth?" she asked. "What about humanity's home system?" "Humanity will face its own transformation," the architect replied. "Your species must evolve beyond its current limitations while maintaining the essential characteristics that make individual consciousness possible. Some humans will join the hybrid networks. Others will remain purely individual. Both paths are necessary for the galaxy's survival." As their ship prepared to return to consortium space, Sarah realized that everything had changed. They were no longer trying to prove that humans deserved recognition as intelligent beings. They were carrying back the knowledge that would transform every intelligent species in the galaxy into something unprecedented in cosmic history. The real work was just beginning. And success would determine not just the future of their galaxy, but the future of consciousness itself in a universe where perfect unity threatened to eliminate all diversity and creativity. The void was coming. But, thanks to the architect's millennia of preparation, the galaxy would be ready. The return journey to consortium space took on the urgency of a race against cosmic time itself. Sarah and her transformed team spent every day of the 11-month voyage developing practical methods for converting entire civilizations to hybrid consciousness systems. What they were attempting had never been done before: the voluntary evolution of consciousness across multiple species simultaneously. The psychological resistance will be enormous, Vexhai observed during one of their planning sessions. His individual consciousness, now enhanced by hybrid connection protocols, could process collective decision-making patterns while maintaining his essential Zolonian perspective. We are asking species to abandon the very foundations of their identity. Not abandon, Sarah corrected, fine-tuning the translation algorithms that would make hybrid consciousness adoption possible across radically different neural architectures. Transform. Evolution always builds on existing foundations, it doesn't destroy them. But, privately, Sarah understood Vexhai's concern. They were returning to the consortium with a proposal that would sound insane to any consciousness pattern that hadn't experienced hybrid integration directly: voluntarily adopt a form of awareness that combined the vulnerability of individual thought with the coordination of collective networks, all in preparation for a threat that wouldn't arrive for 3 centuries. The first indication of the challenge they faced came when their ship entered consortium space and was immediately surrounded by a military escort formation. Dr. Chen, came a transmission from the lead vessel: "You have been gone for nearly 2 years without contact. The consortium requires immediate debriefing regarding your interaction with the entities controlling the silence generators." Sarah exchanged glances with her team. 2 years to them had felt like a lifetime of learning and transformation, but to the consortium it had been an anxious period of waiting for news about the most significant threat to collective consciousness in galactic history. "We have much to report," Sarah transmitted back, "but our findings will require careful explanation." The debriefing took place in the same great assembly where Sarah had first demonstrated the silence generator principles, but the atmosphere was entirely different. Instead of the confident collective consciousness that had originally evaluated humanity's intelligence, Sarah found herself facing representatives whose mental patterns showed deep stress and barely controlled fear. "The generators have continued expanding their influence," the Luminare representative reported, its energy patterns flickering with distress. 17 more devices have activated in your absence. Collective consciousness is now impossible across 40% of inhabited star systems. Sarah felt her heart sink. The architects had warned her that the generator expansion would accelerate as more collective consciousness species attempted to study them, but the rate of growth was exceeding even the worst projections. "We need to know how to stop them," the Thexera representative demanded, their unified voice carrying harmonics of desperation. "Our civilization is being systematically dismantled." "The generators cannot be stopped," Sarah replied, "because they are not weapons. They are evolution engines." The mental activity in the chamber immediately spiked to dangerous levels as the assembled representatives processed this statement. Sarah quickly activated her enhanced translation technology, creating a buffer field that protected her team from the psychic storm while allowing communication to continue. "Evolution toward what?" the Verdani representative asked, their root networks trembling with barely controlled anxiety. "Hybrid consciousness," Sarah replied, and began the most important presentation of her life. Over the next 6 hours, she explained everything: the architects, the void, the necessity of developing consciousness patterns that could resist perfect unity while maintaining coordinated diversity. She demonstrated hybrid consciousness integration, showed her team's successful resistance to void simulation, and laid out the 3-century timeline for galactic transformation. The reaction was exactly what she had expected: initial disbelief, followed by horror at the scope of the threat, followed by resistance to the proposed solution. "You are asking us to voluntarily abandon the very nature of our consciousness," the pelagic representative sang, its harmonics carrying tones of profound rejection. "Collective consciousness defines our existence. Without it, we cease to be ourselves. You are asking us to trust the word of entities that have been manipulating galactic civilization for millennia without our knowledge or consent," the Zolonian representative added, his 4 eyes blinking in patterns that Sarah recognized as extreme agitation. But it was the response from the newest consortium member that surprised everyone. "Dr. Chen is correct," said Ambassador Kethvar from the recently contacted Nexus species. "We have encountered the void before." The mental activity in the chamber went completely silent. The Nexus were a relatively primitive species by consortium standards, barely achieving interstellar travel before first contact. For them to claim knowledge of a cosmic scale threat was unprecedented.
Explain, the luminary representative demanded. Kethvar's consciousness pattern, Sarah noticed, was unlike any other she had encountered.
The nexus seemed to exist in a natural hybrid state, maintaining individual perspectives while sharing common knowledge frameworks, exactly what the architects were trying to teach the rest of the galaxy to achieve. Our home galaxy was consumed 700 years ago, Kethvar explained, her words sending shock waves through the assembled minds.
We are refugees.
The few Nexus survivors in this galaxy are all that remains of a civilization that once spanned millions of star systems. She activated a projection device that showed images of galactic structures Sarah recognized from the architect's records, the empty spaces where thriving civilizations had once existed. The entity you call the Void approaches slowly, offering perfect unity and the elimination of the chaos of individual thought.
Most species find the offer attractive.
They surrender their diversity willingly, believing they are achieving something greater. The holographic display showed the process, entire worlds going silent as their populations integrated into the Void's perfect consciousness, star systems emptying as their inhabitants abandoned physical existence in favor of pure unity, galaxies gradually dimming as diversity and creativity disappeared. Those who resist are absorbed by force, Kethvar continued.
Individual consciousness is overwhelmed by scale.
Collective consciousness is seduced by the promise of perfect coordination. Only hybrid consciousness has the strength to maintain itself in the Void's presence.
The assembled representatives struggled to process this information.
For species that had never encountered existential threats beyond local conflicts or natural disasters, the concept of galaxy-spanning conscious entities was almost incomprehensible.
How do we know this is true? The Thexera representative asked. How do we know the Nexus are not part of some elaborate deception?
Sarah activated her own projection systems, showing the star maps the architects had provided.
Because their story matches the evidence. Look at the galactic distribution patterns.
Look at the empty regions that should contain civilizations but show no signs of intelligent activity.
Look at the expansion vectors.
The mathematics were undeniable. Something was systematically eliminating consciousness from galaxy after galaxy, moving in patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than random destruction. Even if this is true, the Verdani representative said slowly, the solution you propose is worse than the threat.
You are asking us to become something alien to our own nature.
I am asking you to become something stronger than your own nature, Sarah replied. Hybrid consciousness doesn't eliminate collective or individual awareness, it enhances both by combining their strengths while eliminating their weaknesses. She activated her most advanced demonstration technology, creating a localized hybrid consciousness field that encompassed the entire assembly. For the first time in their existence, the consortium representatives experienced what it felt like to maintain their species' characteristic consciousness patterns while simultaneously accessing the processing power and coordination capabilities of every other species present. The effect was transformative.
The Zilonians discovered that their crystalline thought structures could interface with Verdani root networks to create mathematical models of unprecedented complexity.
The Thexera found that their unified decision-making processes could incorporate luminary energy consciousness to achieve coordination across interstellar distances. The Pelagics learned that their sonic communication systems could carry Nexus hybrid patterns to facilitate translation between radically different consciousness types. Most remarkably, none of them lost their essential identity in the process.
The Zilonians remained uniquely Zilonian, the Verdani stayed connected to their plant-based heritage, and the Thexera maintained their collective nature.
But all of them gained access to capabilities that their individual species could never have achieved alone. This is what the galaxy must become, Sarah announced as the demonstration reached its peak. Not a collection of separate species struggling to communicate across incompatible consciousness patterns, but a truly integrated civilization that preserves diversity while achieving unity of purpose. When she deactivated the demonstration field, the silence in the assembly lasted for several minutes. Sarah could see the representatives struggling to process what they had experienced, the first taste of consciousness potential that transcended everything they had previously imagined possible.
The process will take decades, the Luminari representative said finally, its energy patterns stabilizing into configurations Sarah had never seen before, patterns that suggested fundamental internal changes had occurred during the demonstration. We have 3 centuries, Sarah replied, but the transformation must begin immediately. Every day we delay, more systems fall under generator influence, and more species lose the ability to achieve voluntary hybrid integration. Over the following months, Sarah worked with teams from every consortium species to develop practical hybrid consciousness adoption protocols. The work was more complex than anything that had ever been attempted in galactic history, requiring not just technological development but fundamental psychological and philosophical changes across entire civilizations. Some species adapted quickly. The nexus, already existing in natural hybrid states, served as teachers and guides for other species beginning the integration process. The Zilonians, with their mathematical approach to consciousness, developed systematic methods for maintaining individual creativity within collective coordination frameworks. Others struggled enormously. The Thex era found it almost impossible to maintain individual perspectives within their unified structure without triggering what they considered psychological fragmentation. The Verdani discovered that hybrid consciousness required them to separate from their root networks for extended periods, causing severe anxiety in beings who had never existed as disconnected individuals. But progress was steady. As more species achieved successful hybrid integration, they became resources for helping others through the transformation process. The galaxy began developing something unprecedented, a truly cooperative civilization based not on the dominance of any single consciousness pattern, but on the collaborative enhancement of all consciousness patterns. The real test came 5 years into the transformation process, when the consortium encountered their first Void Scout probe. The entity appeared without warning in a remote star system, its presence immediately detectable by the complete cessation of all consciousness activity within its range. Traditional collective consciousness networks simply vanished when they came into contact with the probe, their unified structures absorbed into the entity's perfect unity. Individual consciousness patterns were overwhelmed and incorporated before they could mount any significant resistance. But the hybrid consciousness networks that Sarah had helped establish responded differently. When the Void probe attempted to absorb their unified aspects, it encountered individual resistance that prevented complete integration. When it tried to overwhelm their individual aspects, it faced collective coordination that provided mutual support and defense. The probe found itself unable to process consciousness patterns that were simultaneously unified and diverse, collective and individual. After several failed absorption attempts, it simply departed, apparently returning to report on the unexpected resistance it had encountered. First contact with the Void, Sarah announced to the assembled consortium representatives, and successful resistance achieved. The hybrid consciousness networks held. The relief in the chamber was palpable, but Sarah knew this was only the beginning. The Scout probe had been testing galactic defenses, gathering information about the consciousness patterns it would need to overcome when the main Void entity arrived. They will adapt, she warned. The Void learns from every encounter. We need to continue evolving our hybrid consciousness capabilities, developing new forms of resistance that the enemy cannot predict or counter. The next phase of galactic evolution had begun in earnest. Species that had never imagined consciousness could exist in forms other than their own were learning to transcend their limitations while maintaining their essential identities. The galaxy was becoming something that had never existed before, a truly hybrid civilization capable of coordinating across vast distances while preserving the diversity and creativity that made consciousness valuable. And, at the center of it all stood humanity, the species whose greatest strength had always been their ability to think alone. But, now they were teaching the galaxy that the highest form of consciousness was not thinking alone or thinking together, but learning to think alone and together simultaneously. Sarah looked up at the stars through the Great Assembly's transparent dome, knowing that somewhere out there, the Void was preparing for an encounter unlike anything it had experienced in millions of years of galactic conquest. For the first time in cosmic history, it would face consciousness patterns that could resist perfect unity without rejecting beneficial cooperation. The quiet revolution that had begun with humanity's struggle for recognition as intelligent beings had become something far greater, the transformation of consciousness itself into a force capable of preserving diversity and creativity against the ultimate threat of perfect, sterile unity. The galaxy was ready. The real test was about to begin. In the end, Sarah realized, the measure of intelligence was not how well a mind could connect with others, but
how effectively it could maintain its unique perspective while contributing to something greater than itself. Humanity had taught the galaxy that the most profound form of consciousness was not unity or isolation, but the courage to be simultaneously individual and collective, diverse and coordinated, alone and together.
The void was coming.
But it would find a galaxy that had learned to be magnificently, creatively, and indestructibly conscious in ways that perfect unity could never understand or absorb. The master focus that had once intimidated ordinary minds had become the foundation for consciousness that could intimidate the universe itself.